Hi there, you're listening to a podcast that's created and sponsored by Second Avenue Baptist Church. If you enjoy what you hear today, check out our website and app by visiting secondavenuembc.org. You can find our mobile app and tons more content, podcasts, sermons, and more by searching for Second Avenue on the Apple App Store or Google Play Store. With that being said, let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome to episode 72 of Decision Point. Today we'll be discussing what is an ordinance. Well, thank you for joining me once again. So glad to have you here. What is an ordinance in the church? What does that mean? What is the significance? We talked about it last week just a little bit. Today we're going to dive a little bit further into it. And before we get into the meat of what we're talking about today, here's today's trivia. Which church or churches in the New Testament are specifically mentioned to observe the Lord's Supper? Stick around to the end of the podcast for the answer to that question. Well, today we are going to begin with a very simple but important question. What is an ordinance? Now, in ordinary language, an ordinance is something commanded or ordered. Now, in church language, Baptists use the word ordinance for the two practices that Christ gave to his church specifically, baptism and the Lord's Supper. In Matthew 28:19-20, Jesus gives the church the command to make disciples, baptize them, and teach them to observe all of what Christ commanded. Now, the commandments of Christ are things like forgiveness, love your neighbors, enemies, and friends, love God above all, seek his kingdom, give generously, and etc. But baptism and the Lord's Supper are the two specific physical ceremonies that Christ decreed for us to observe. That's why they are singled out as the ordinances. Baptism is not optional. It's not a decoration added to Christianity. It's one of the ways believers publicly obeys Christ and identifies with him. In Luke 22:19, Jesus commands his disciples to observe the Lord's Supper in remembrance of him, which very specifically tells us that these two, being direct commandments, are not of just church tradition or invented by a committee. It comes from Jesus Christ himself. And 1 Corinthians 11:23-26 shows us that the early church continued the practice of the Lord's Supper, and they used it to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. The Lord's Supper looks backward to the cross and forward to Christ's return. Baptism itself represents the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the finished work. Now, the Baptist position here is that these two pictorial ordinances, baptism and the Lord's Supper, they picture the truth. They don't save us. They don't complete our salvation. They're not part of our growing salvation, and they don't add grace to us in any redeeming way. They simply point to what Christ has already done, what the believer has received by faith, and in the case of the Lord's Supper is to remind us that he is coming once again. Now, there is a confusion that can be led when we talk about pictorial ordinances or just referencing what has happened or what will happen, but we don't want you to understand that these are unimportant rituals. So many church personnel throughout history and unfortunately from now on will not really follow these out, believing they're not important. But Christ commanded that we should practice it first and foremost. That makes it important. But number two, believers should understand what it means. Just because they're symbolic doesn't mean they're empty. A very simple analogy we can all understand is the wedding ceremony and the wedding ring. You don't have to have a ceremony with all the traditional ways that we do things here in the United States or anywhere across the world in order to be married. Nor is a wedding ring necessary to make that official in the eyes of God or in the eyes of the state. They're very much symbolic. The ceremony is the celebration, gathering together where people get to enjoy the joining of two souls forever. The wedding ring simply is a way of showing the outside world that I belong to somebody else. In the same way, baptism and the Lord's Supper are symbolic acts, but they're filled with meaning. And not just any meaning, they're filled with the gospel meaning. When any church loses the meaning of the ordinances, they'll still keep the outward actions, but they lose the teaching power and the impact behind them. People see baptism and the Lord's Supper, but oftentimes don't really understand the true power behind them and what they mean. So the application is very simple. Every believer should be able to answer two basic questions. What did Christ command his church to do? And why did he command them to do it? When we understand the ordinances, we're not just preserving a tradition passed down. We are seeking to obey Christ clearly and doing it together. This matters for every church member because the ordinances don't belong only to the pastors or teachers. They are practiced by the local church, and therefore the laity, the regular church member, needs to understand their importance. Well, that was a really short podcast today, but it's all right. We're going to come back next week with some more information on the Lord's Supper and follow that up with some more information about baptism as well, diving into each one of those individually. So look forward to seeing you at the next episode. But before I go, got to answer today's trivia question. The question was, which church or churches in the New Testament are specifically mentioned to observe the Lord's Supper? Well, that would be two specifically. The church in Corinth, according to 1 Corinthians 11, 20-43, and according to Acts 27, the church at Troas. While we're sure all of them did practice it, those are the two mentioned. I want to thank you again for joining me today and listening to our message. If you would like to know more about what's happening at Second Avenue Missionary Baptist Church, download our app on your mobile device, Second Avenue Missionary Baptist Church, or MBC. Or visit our website, secondavenuembc.org. On the app and website, you can listen to past and live sermons, check out other podcasts, and learn more about our ministry. Thank you for spending time with me today, and join me again next week for another Decision Point.
Thank you for listening today, and if you enjoyed what you heard, consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review. It will help us reach more people just like you who need to hear this message. Also remember that you can stay connected with us by downloading our mobile app. Just search for Second Avenue spelled out on the App Store or Google Play Store. Thank you again for listening, and God bless.